Welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our UIKit tutorial series by taking a look at how we can use UI table view diffable data sources to populate our table views with data as opposed to using the traditional UI table view data source protocol in a separate object. Now, of course, you can extend UITableViewDiffableDataSource, but that is an exceptionally rare case. Maybe you want to include editing functionality and with swipe to delete. You could do that, and that's fine, but why not just use a swipe action for that? At least that's my view on it. But that's besides the point of today's video. Now, if you watched the previous video, you know that we've already covered UICollectionViewDataSource or DiffableDataSource, and I explain how diffable data sources work in that video, but I don't expect you to have seen that video. So I will explain everything that I explained in that video, in this video, in the event that you're watching this entirely separately from watching the series linearly. All right, so let's get started by talking about what exactly is a diffable data source. Well, we know that a normal UI table view data source is meant to handle tasks related to the source of data for our table view. So the number of items in the table, the number of sections in the table, configuration of the cells in the table, that kind of stuff. However, the UI table view diffable data source does a lot of that for us and then some. So the things it takes care of for us is determining the number of items that we need in our table, the number of sections for our table, and it manages updating the user interface and the underlying table view data that we work with in our table. Now, that does not mean that it manages the source of data like an array of objects or something. We still have to manage that. However, updating the user interface to reflect those changes, animating the changes to match the differences, that sort of stuff is handled by the diffable data source. And the way that a diffable data source does all of that is by using what are called snapshots. Now, snapshots are effectively snapshots, hence the name, of the current state and the new state of data. It then performs a task called diffing, where it automatically calculates the differences between the two snapshots. And then, when it's done calculating the differences, it will then trigger an update to the UI. And depending on if you have specified whether or not you want it animated, it will animate it. It'll animate those changes. Now, if we were just using UI table view data source, the animating the data in particular is cumbersome. It's difficult, especially with complex changes to the data. And then, frankly, updating the table view using remove item or remove cells, insert cells, that kind of stuff. Simply, that's just error prone. It works as long as you are careful with what you're doing and you get it right, but it is still error prone. So that is why the diffable data source takes care of that for you. Now, the UI table view diffable data source does does conform to UITableViewDataSource. That's why it's able to do a lot of that stuff for you under the hood. I urge you to read up on the documentation for this as well, so you can get a little bit more in-depth understanding of everything it can do. In this video, we're just going to be taking a look at a fraction of what it can do. The most basic, bare-bones functionality of what diffable data sources can do, but they can do more than what I'm showing here. All right, now that we've taken a look at kind of what these things are and how they work, let's actually start implementing it. So inside of Xcode, let's go ahead and run our app so we kind of see what we're working with as a starter. So to start with, we have a navigation controller. This navigation controller has a view controller inside it. This view controller has a UI table view that takes up its entire safe area. And this is where we're going to display all of our data. In the navigation bar, we have a delete button that is a trash can symbol. And what this button is going to do, I already have the action method coded for this, is it will choose an index at random and delete that item from the table view. Now, generally speaking, in a real-world application, that's not something you're going to want to do, for the simple reason of you can't just go around and willy-nilly randomly deleting data in your app. But the reason I'm doing this here is simply for educational purposes, so you can see how that diffing process actually works, you know, with animating the differences and all of that stuff. So let's go ahead now and actually go and begin the implementation. The first thing we're going to do is at the top of our view controller, I am going to, let's see here. All right, we're going to create a lazy variable called DataSource. Now, this is going to be set to the results of a method we haven't created yet called makeDataSource. This method will return an instance of UITableViewDiffableDataSource. And the reason why we're going to make this lazy is because we need to make sure that this variable is initialized after the view controller itself is initialized. So, lazy is the perfect candidate for that, because if you watched my Swift series, or if you are familiar with the concept of lazy and lazy loading, this variable will only have a value once we request it. So once we request to use the value, then it will retrieve that value. All right, so let's go ahead and say lazy var data source equals make data source. There we go. All right. Now what we'll do is inside of configure, I'm gonna go. All right. So here we'll say locations dot data source equals data source. All right, and once this line is executed, locations.dataSource equals data source, only then will it retrieve that data source object. And we can execute this safely here because configure is called after the view is loaded, and the view is loaded after the view controller itself has already been long initialized. So it's perfectly safe to call it here. All right. Next, we need to create an extension on our view controller where we're going to place these the next steps of our implementation, which is to create that make data source method, create another method called apply snapshot. You strictly don't have to do it that way. You can create the snapshots and apply them and all that stuff every single time you do something, but this is a much more maintainable and reusable way, and more testable, mind you. And then we're also going to create 2 type aliases to make our code a little bit more readable and much less verbose. So let's go ahead and go into our project navigator. All right, I'm going to right click on the main group for the project here. And I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to say Swift file. We're going to call this view controller plus data source methods. Okay. View controller plus data source methods. Okay. I'm going to change the, well, we don't even need the comment, so that's fine. All right, we're going to get rid of the comment up here. We're going to get rid of the import for foundation. We'll change that to UIKit. Next, extension, view controller, like that. All right, so let's create those type aliases. The first one is going to be called data source. Now, data source is going to be a type alias for the UITableViewDiffableDataSource type. So we'll say type alias data source, capital D, capital S, equals UITableViewDiffableDataSource. Now, the UITableViewDiffableDataSource type takes 2 generic type parameters. The first is a hashable type that will represent the sections in the table. The second is another hashable type that will represent the model for our data. So in this case, it's going to be location, because we're going to list some landmarks in a table using a location object. So we'll say here, section. We haven't created this section type yet, and we will here in a moment after we're done with our type aliases. Our angle brackets, section, and then location, like that. Next, we'll say type alias. The next type alias is going to be snapshot. And this is going to be a type alias for the NSDiffableDataSource snapshot type, which takes the same 2 generic type parameters that the diffableDataSource type does. So equals NS diffable data source snapshot. And then inside of angle brackets, we'll say section and location. Now let's double check to make sure that our type aliases are correctly created here. Diffable data source. Section, location. Okay, cool. Now, of course, we have an error saying we can't find the type section. And that's fine because we're going to go ahead and create that now. Section is going to be an enumeration to make it easier, because an enum is hashable on its own. So we can say enum section, and because we're only going to have one section in this table, we are going to say case main and leave it alone. Now you could, seeing as we have both monuments and national parks for our location categories, you could split them into multiple sections, and I urge you to try to do that as sort of a challenge in this video. How would you create multiple sections and add only the items that need to be in that section to that section? All right. And keep in mind, too, that if you figure out how to do it for the UITableViewDiffableDataSource, if you manage to successfully complete the challenge for this video, the same thing will apply to UICollectionViewDiffableDataSource. So once you know how to do it for one diffable data source type, you know how to do it for the other. All right. Now that we have our enum, let's create the two methods for creating the data source and applying a snapshot. Func make data source. It needs to return a data source like that. This doesn't take in any parameters. Next, we're going to let data source, so create a constant called data source, and we're going to set this equal to UITableViewDiffableDataSource. Now that would be if you weren't using a type alias. But we are, so we'll use data source. Now, the initializer for our diffable data source takes two parameters. First, the table view that we want associated with our data source. Second, it takes in a cell provider. This cell provider is where we are going to define our cells for the table. Similar to how you would, well, exactly the same code, for the most part, that you would put inside of the cell for row at inside of the UITableViewDataSource protocol. So let's pass it locations, which is the table view that we're going to use. And then our cell provider we're going to have as a trailing closure now this cell provider takes in 3 parameters, or exposes 3 parameters to us, and then it's going to return a optional, some optional UI table view cell, whether it be a subclass of UI table view cell or a UI table view cell object on it, on its own. This has to be optional, right? So the way we're going to do this is the first parameter is going to be the table view itself. So table view, comma, the index path is the second parameter. So the index path for each cell. And then the third is going to be a location. This third parameter is always going to be the type that you specify as the item type generic parameter of the diffable data source. So I'm going to say a location. Make sure that we are going to be returning a location cell and make that optional in. Now, location cell is a UI table view cell subclass, so it will work here. All right. Now, before we do anything in our cell provider, let's return data source. So now we're not getting yelled at for not returning the diffable data source of our method here. Then, now, inside of here, again, this is inside of our cell provider is going to be the same code that you would put when you're configuring your cell for, when you're doing a UI table view data source the traditional way. So first, we need to get our cell by dequeuing a reusable cell with a reuse identifier, and then trying to cast that to a location cell. So guard let cell equals table view dot dequeue reusable cell with identifier. And we're going to pass that, not color, location cell dot reuse identifier as location cell. Otherwise, we will simply return nil. Like that. Next, we're going to say cell.set, and we'll pass it the location, and then return our cell. Simple as that. Now, the set method for our location cell, that will set its configuration, its content configuration. And we have that set to a UI hosting configuration that will render a SwiftUI view as the cell's contents instead of using the traditional UIKit layout code. Which, frankly, I recommend doing it that way because that's a more modern approach. But you can do it the traditional way. I covered that already when we took a look at how we did that in a previous video. But that is our data source. So that's our data source object. Lastly, we need to apply the snapshot. So next we'll say func apply snapshot. This will take in a Boolean. We'll just call it animate. This is going to be a bool and is going to have a default value of true. Now, my rationale behind using a default value here is that in 99.9% of cases, the vast majority of cases, you're going to want to animate the changes made to your collection view or your table view or whatever the case might be when using a diffable data source. However, I also want to be able to provide the option to set this to false, because maybe reduce motion is turned on, right? Maybe your user doesn't want animations. Well, then you could listen for that. You could retrieve that accessibility setting, and if reduce motion is enabled, you could turn it off. Right? You could turn off animations, and it would work just fine. All right. So inside of this method, we are going to create a snapshot object. So var snapshot equals capital S snapshot. And so we're using our type alias here because NS diffable data source snapshot is a very long type, just like UITableViewDiffableDataSource. You can already see how this makes our code much more readable and less verbose. Next, we want to append the sections that we're going to use for our snapshot. So we'll say snapshot.append sections. This takes in an array of section identifiers. So in this case, because we only have one section, it'll be an array containing only main. Then we need to append the items we want to include in our snapshot, which in this case, for this reusable method, you could write multiple depending on what you want to do. We're going to say snapshot.append items. Now, if we take a look in our autocomplete, we can see there are two options for appending items to a snapshot. First, you can just append an entire or a section of an array of item type identifiers to our snapshot, which the first one will do exactly that. It just simply takes in an array of item identifiers. The second option is we can append items from an array of item identifiers to a specific section. So really, it just depends. Which one you use depends on how you want to insert or even delete your data. In this case, we are only going to use the first one. But again, I urge you to experiment a little bit. So we'll pass this our landmarks array inside of our view controller, which has all of our location objects stored inside of it from my constants file. And the last step is to apply the snapshot to the diffable data source. At which point we can not only tell it to apply those changes, but we can tell it whether or not we want it to be animated, and then it will perform the diffing process and update the UI accordingly. So we can say data source we'll set that equals data source dot apply, and it takes in a snapshot. So we'll say snapshot, and then we can also tell it animating differences and animate like that. And we have our extension completed. We now have both the methods for creating the data source and for applying a snapshot to that data source. Let's go ahead and save this file and go back to our view controller. The last thing we need to do is we need to apply that snapshot for an initial display of our data. Otherwise, we're not going to see anything. So I'm going to do this underneath where we have our constraints. We'll say apply snapshot. We'll save this. And before we go any further, I do want to show the I do want to show the location object, because it is kind of important that we understand how I've built this object. So I'm going to jump to the definition of my locations array instead of constants. And then from there, we can jump to our location struct definition. So here I have a structure called location. The location structure conforms to the hashable protocol. Inside of the structure, we have a enum called category for determining whether or not it's a monument or a national park. We have an ID, which is an integer. We have a name, which is a string. We have a category of type category. We have coordinates of type CL location coordinate 2D. So if you want to display it on a map, we can do that. Next, we are implementing the hash method from Hashable. This is standard code for implementing Hashable, but it's not strictly necessary. Now, you may notice in out that that is a keyword in Swift that it's a little bit more advanced. I'll leave a link in the description for documentation on this keyword, but effectively what in-out does is it allows you to pass in what is effectively a pointer to the memory address of the variable you're passing in using an ampersand. And you can then modify the value of that parameter inside of the method, which then that updated value will then be projected outward to be the new value of that variable. If you're familiar with the concept of out variables in C#, if you know C#, it works pretty much like that. Then we needed to make sure that our location structure conformed to equatable, even though we're not explicitly saying that we want to conform to just equatable. Hashable kind of forces it on us in this instance. So I have an override of the equality operator, the double equals, which is required by equatable. And pretty much how this is implemented, you should know how this is implemented just by looking at it, because this is simple Swift syntax, right? We're just returning a Boolean expression where we're making sure that every single property of the left and right hand sides of the double equals operator are the same. So they have to have the same ID, name, category, latitude and longitude coordinates, and the same, just the same everything, in order for them to be considered equal. So with that, that is our location object. Let's go ahead and run our code. We get a successful build. Right, and so we have all of our items in our table view. You can see we have an image that is a map, and then we have the name of the location. Pretty simple stuff. However, we need one change in our method to delete a random item, and that is we need to apply a snapshot every time we make a change. Excuse me. So at the bottom of our view controller, I want to close location. All right. So after we remove a specific location from our locations, or our landmarks array rather, we need to call apply snapshot. Save that and run the code. There we go. Let's go ahead and tap the delete button and take a look at what happens. So we've deleted a landmark and it went away. It animated the change. We can get rid of another one. Get rid of another one. And another one. And another one. Right? So you can see it just goes and deletes random items. And when the snapshot is applied, the data source goes and does its thing. So that pretty much does it for this video on diffable data sources with a table view. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.